The free agent negotiation period begins already on Monday. So let's put together a big board ranking the free agents that the Chicago Bears should be going after next week.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit the subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. On the show today, we put together a big board ranking the free agents that the Chicago Bears should pursue this upcoming week. I mean, it's really next week. Monday is when things really get rolling here, at least the open negotiation period before the new league year starts on Wednesday. So we're going to split this group, this free agent class really into three tiers, three groups. There's the high-end, sort of like impact players, guys that feel as close to a quote-unquote sure thing as you can get in free agency. Kind of the big fish that you feel like, given the cap space the Bears have, they got to come away with hopefully at least one, but you're not expecting them to get more than, probably more than two in this sort of range of player. We'll go through maybe that next tier, second tier guys that are very good or a lot to like, but are no sure thing. And maybe there's some upside there that you're hoping for better in their next destination in Chicago, but they're not going to be top of their position, cream of the crop type guys, but some very good guys that I would imagine the Bears will likely sign a few of and focus a lot of their efforts more in this area rather than paying top dollar for some of the top end guys we talk about at the beginning. And we'll wrap up with some good value players, guys that won't cost a ton and might be, lesser players, but maybe perhaps some low risk, high reward options in there, and some guys that you take a flyer on and hope to get some really good value for. And those are kind of the free agent signings that can separate the good GMs from the great GMs when you find really good players at really good value. But we start with the players at the top of the food chain here, the big name free agents. And it's not a very strong free agent class at the top in this way, right? There's not 10 guys out there that you feel like are household names that the Bears, you'd love for the Bears to sign any of those 10 guys and feel like the team is going to get a massive, massive upgrade. But there's a handful of guys. I think there's, more or less one or so guys at each position that I kind of want to go through as options that feel like at least some level above the rest of the free agent class at their own positions. And I want to look at this more like a horizontal big board. I don't know how we can really rank, how are we supposed to rank whether a defensive tackle ranks higher than a wide receiver or an offensive tackle if we're trying to big board the Bears free agent class here, because you don't want to sign 4 defensive tackles, but you might sign 1, maybe 2 if they're different type of defensive tackles, and then you'll also need to sign other guys at other positions. So I think of this as like a horizontal board where it's like, okay, here's the guys at every position at this level, and then we'll go to the next tier and look across the positions and so on and so forth. So like, for example, Javon Hargrave, kind of the top defensive lineman, maybe the top pass rusher across the board that you're going to think about as a Bears target here. I mean, he's a 10-sack guy, thrived with the Philadelphia Eagles at the 3-technique spot. He played some 5-technique defensive end with the Steelers before that and has been a fairly consistent pass rusher throughout his career, while despite being, 30 years old, on the older side of the type of free agents the Bears are going to look at here. Sticking around that spot, like, I don't think of Dalvin Tomlinson from the Giants and the Vikings as, the high impact player, but as far as nose tackles go, he's going to be the cream of the crop there. And he's going to be maybe high impact in the running game, not going to be a top flight pass rusher. And so, right, he doesn't quite feel like on the exact same tier as Javon Hargrave. But as far as nose tackles go, where the Bears have a pretty significant need, he seems to be the top option there, that you wouldn't be surprised if the Bears pursued someone like that to really shore up the middle of their defensive line. I struggled with whether or not to put Marcus Davenport from the New Orleans Saints as the top tier of free agent 4-3 defensive ends for the Bears here. I feel like the pass rushing consistency that he's shown over the last handful of seasons, despite what the sack numbers will tell you, the pressure numbers have been pretty consistent each and every year. His pass rush win rate has been about the same. He's been a consistent pass rusher on the edge, and the Bears need that. And he's young and still, I think, ascending in his career, and he feels like maybe a slight, even if it's just a half step above some of the other edge rushers in free agency. It's not a very strong or deep free agent class. At wide receiver, I feel like Odell Beckham is kind of that like high impact, sure thing free agent wide receiver. I think a lot of people point to Jacoby Myers as the sort of the young guy that the Bears would be more inclined to go after, and I agree. I don't think Odell Beckham is probably going to come to the Chicago Bears. But if I'm going to big board power rank free agent wide receivers, I mean, we know Odell's coming off of an injury and missed a whole season, but like we know what Odell Beckham Jr. is, and I feel like comparatively to somebody like Jacoby Myers, Myers just had his career best year, but wasn't even a 1,000-yard guy, and we know how great Odell Beckham can be. So he feels to me like if we're going to be honest about the wide receiver talent there, it's probably him, even if it's unrealistic to come to the Bears. If I'm the Bears general manager and I'm stacking up which free agent wide receivers are better, it's probably going to be Odell Beckham for me. Or on the offensive line, right? Orlando Brown is kind of the top left tackle. We talked just yesterday or the day before about how I don't know that I would be on board with spending the kind of money Orlando Brown seems to be seeking. I think he's a good player, but not a player that's worth that, and not a player that's worth that to the Chicago Bears. So I throw Mike McGlinchey in there as probably the top right tackle in my book in this free agent class that I would be thrilled to see the Bears go out and sign there. And I think, again, any of these kind of guys to feel like you're getting not a blue chip player, because there's not really that true blue chip in free agency, but just a guy that you're really, really going to like what you get with him at that spot. If I had to throw a linebacker in there, it would probably be Tremaine Edmonds from the Buffalo Bills, who really came on strong in his final season. Things seem to be kind of clicking after 5 years in the NFL, but he's still only like 24, 25 years old because he came in so young. But he's not, I wouldn't call him a sure thing, but I think he'd probably be my first choice linebacker when it's all said and done. And maybe that's a better way to describe this tier. It's not all, some of them are high impact players, but it's not all high impact players, but it's kind of like the best of their position group in free agency. Those are kind of the guys to me that you'd like to see the Bears maybe land one of them at one of those spots to feel like, okay, they went and got the best they could at that spot. And then you start to fill it in the rest of the roster and some other starting spots with players that are second tier, guys that are pretty good and guys that you can be excited about, but just aren't like, home runs or aren't a sure thing or have some kind of questions, but you still feel like things are probably going to work out okay with them. We'll get to know that list of players that's a little bit more expansive, and you get a more variety of options across each position next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's free bonus bets right back to you if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And just because we're in the offseason doesn't mean there isn't football to bet on. They've already got odds for next season's division winners, where the Lions are the betting favorites to win the NFC North. The Bears in last place at plus 420. But if you believe in that turnaround, betting with our friends at FanDuel is going to be the place to do it. Plus, you can bet on the NFL draft, college football, the XFL, and all of your favorite sports across the sports landscape. So check out our friends at FanDuel, and don't miss your chance. Don't forget your chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA and NFL. I don't think we're going to see Ryan Poles be eager to necessarily try and break the bank on one big free agent at the front end. Despite having the most salary cap space of any team this offseason, it just to me doesn't feel like Ryan Poles is going to want to be in the bidding war. I don't think he's a guy who's so eager to, there's going to be a free agent that he just absolutely has to have and that there are no other options that he wouldn't rather spend less on. That doesn't mean we won't see him hand out a big contract to a player, and I still think they end up perhaps with one of those guys we just talked about, but they're not going to go crazy here. And I think he looks around at this Bears roster and sees a number of either holes or positions that can use additional talent, even if it's not a glaring hole, right? Like there's a big hole at right tackle, but there's not necessarily like the same hole at cornerback, but you could use more talent at cornerback. And it feels to me like we're going to see him take a quantity over quality approach to some extent, right? And there's still going to be quality in there, but I think we're going to see him go for more of the second and lower tier free agents and not, blow a big wad of cash on one big time top end free agent. And it feels like it's going to be a nice conglomerate of second tier free agents that you can still feel good about, even if it's not going to be the super exciting household names that you might want or hope for or be maybe, that much more fired up about. Like on the defensive line, maybe Hargrave is a little bit too old for the type of player Ryan Poles is going to look for in free agency. And so then you look to guys we've heard a little bit about this offseason, Dre'Mont Jones from the Denver Broncos or Zach Allen from the Arizona Cardinals. Neither one, exactly the traditional 3-tech role that they'll play in Chicago, but have both lined up in that spot and played that type of role before, and both have shown some pass rushing upside from the interior, but neither one has been a double-digit sack guy, and both guys have played significant portions of their career with top-end pass rushers around them that perhaps make their job a little bit easier, and that's why they're in this tier, because they don't have the elite production, and they haven't had to do it solely on their own. They haven't had to be number one pass rushing options. So presumably, they can still come to Chicago and be very good, but maybe not great, maybe not elite. And the idea is that perhaps you'd have to spend less to get them. Dre'Mont Jones sounds like a guy whose market seems significant, and you wonder what kind of money he's going to get and if he'll live up to that money. I find myself a little bit tepid there, just given how the hype has built, but we'll see what the market might bring for him. But the Bears need defensive linemen, particularly on that interior. So, I feel both of those guys are going to be very real options there. Or on the edge, right? We talked about Frank Clark being released on yesterday's podcast, talking about franchise tag guys. He's down here in this tier for me. Or like Yannick Ngakoue from the Indianapolis Colts, who's been a fairly consistent pass rusher throughout his career and still only 27, but not like the total game changer, but a very good player that you'd feel pretty good coming away with. Or Arden Key. I believe he had a pretty strong season this year with the Jacksonville Jaguars, if I remember correct. Been going through a lot of free agents here and mixing up my teams here. No, he was with the 49ers. No, he was with the Jaguars this season, 49ers before that. And yeah, an ascending player with some pass rush upside, but has never been like that proven go-to guy. That's why he's more so in this second tier. But there's some different pass rushers there that you feel like, okay, you add them to the mix with Gibson and Robinson, and maybe add a rookie, hopefully an early drafted rookie in there, and you're starting to build some sort of defensive end rotation you can feel a little bit more comfortable about. Or on the offensive line, we talked about a couple of the right tackles that didn't get franchise tagged yesterday. Jawan Taylor and Caleb McGarry, Jaguars and Atlanta Falcons. Both have some flaws. Both have some specific skill sets and some things you have to work around there. It's why they're not top tier offensive tackles, but second tier guys that might cost a little less, certainly less than Orlando Brown and probably a bit less than Mike McGlinchey. Sure, that's not a bad tier to find them in. Or Ethan Posick, the center from the Seattle Seahawks, who really struggled for the first handful of seasons of his career, but put on a really good season this last year with the Cleveland Browns, I believe. Kind of a one-year pop-up, but certainly would be an upgrade over Sam Mustipher and probably better than Lucas Patrick. And you still have those guys around in case something goes wrong, but you don't want to sign a guy to a big contract and worry about something potentially going wrong. So that's where the second tier is, or at linebacker, right? If not the young athletic upside of Tremaine Edmonds, then Bobby Akirike from the Indianapolis Colts. Matt Eberflus is his guy, his former player who led the middle of that defense. He's not a Pro Bowl caliber player, but he's fine. He'd be good. you sign him to a multi-year deal and feel like there's some stability there that's coming at linebacker. That's really where it feels like this tier is. I mean, throw TJ Edwards in there from the Philadelphia Eagles, played really well. Not like, again, a perennial Pro Bowl proven all the time dominant guy, but start him in there and you bring in some other linebacker talent and he can be part of a very good rotation. And I think a lot of the wide receiver class falls into this tier as well, where if Odell is a slight step above, then I put Jacoby Myers in this category. And not that all of these players all these wide receivers are exactly even. I'd still probably, rank them in kind of generally the orders I've generally kind of talked about them here, although I'm not going to say that's a strict spot here, but still, so not to say that these guys are all equal and just get one of them. There's different sort of advantages and disadvantages to each one, but between Jacoby Myers from the New England Patriots, who was kind of their top option this year on a bad wide receiving core, or Juju Smith-Schuster, not expected to return to the Kansas City Chiefs, we know kind of what his ceiling is, but he's also a very good slot player who can do some damage and could be an addition to the Bears offense while not being that true number one wide receiver that you would like to find, but just are not going to in this year's free agent class. Mecole Hardman, another one of those guys where it's like, yeah, he could be a nice complementary piece. We know the kind of speed that he has, and he's another guy that could be on his way out from Kansas City. They may end up keeping Juju Smith-Schuster instead and kind of letting Mecole Hardman walk because he only had about 300 yards this season, but we've seen the kind of speed he's had. But is that Byron Pringle 2.0? I mean, probably would cost a lot more than Byron Pringle did, so you'd kind of hope not. And we can't talk about second-tier wide receivers without mentioning Allen Lazard from the Green Bay Packers, just given Luke Getsy's connection, having coached him for a number of years there up in Green Bay, and him, he's an okay wide receiver. He's a second-tier kind of guy when we talk about free agency this way, but sure, I mean, he would add something to what the Bears currently have at wide receiver. And we can throw in tight end quick, just in the broad category of pass catchers. Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins, very good tight end. Not a need for the Bears, and I would have preferred a guy like Evan Ingram, who got franchise tagged by the Jaguars. But Gesicki could be a pass catching weapon here if you're not in love with the wide receiver options, but still want to get a pass catcher to pair with Cole Kmet. I think Gesicki could be a really good option there. But any of those guys have the potential to sign certainly well above minimum contracts, and perhaps some more than others more expensive. Like, Dre'Mont Jones is expected to be quite pricey, and Jacoby Myers is going to get a pretty good deal at wide receiver, and some of those offensive linemen too. Whereas, maybe some of the other lower end guys are not going to be quite as big on breaking the bank. But then there's another tier of guys that might not even have quite the same pedigree as those guys. These are not going to be guys that you're like, celebrating and running out to buy the jersey for and super excited about being absolute game changers for your Chicago Bears. But if they would come to Chicago on a fairly affordable, low value deal, you feel like there's another group of players here that can give you a lot more than you bargained for, give you a bigger bang for your buck than even the second tier prospects that aren't going to break the bank as much as the first tier free agents here. So let's look around and see where we might be able to find some value at some Chicago Bears positions of need next on Locked On Bears. Yeah. It feels to me like one of the areas where GMs can really separate themselves here is when you can find the free agents that come pretty cheap and end up playing a lot better than what their contract suggested, and you get that really good value, and feel like your front office in general has a knack for finding those free agent diamond in the roughs. Like, those are diamonds in the rough. Like, those are the kind of decisions that can really separate the good GMs from the great GMs that, any GM can realize that the really good player that you spend a lot of money on is going to be good or should be good, but not every GM can find the 1 year, $2 million contract that's going to give you starting level contributions or just high-end contributions that don't necessarily reflect the amount of salary that you paid those players. Now, it's impossible for us to predict, even 4 days out of free agency here, exactly what kind of contracts these guys are going to get. And not all these guys that I'm looking at as value free agents, they're not all going to be 1 year deals. They're certainly not all going to be veteran minimums. I don't think any of them will be like true 1 year or 2 year veteran minimum type guys, but guys that are going to be on contracts, I would say, not universally here as I'm looking at my list, not universally under $5 million a year, but like generally in that under $5 million a year type range, as opposed to some of the other guys we were talking about that are probably more in the 5 to 10 to maybe even pushing 15 with some of the guys up there. But like, for example, Larry Ogunjobi, who Ryan Poles signed last offseason to a $13.5 million a year contract. Ended up signing a one-year deal with the Steelers after the Bears failed his physical. He's not going to get another $13 million a year contract this season. He'll get more, I think, than he got last year in a one-year deal from the Steelers, but still going to be a lot more affordable, I think. And if Ryan Poles still believes in him, I mean, we have to keep mentioning him because of the very clear interest the Bears had last time around and how there's no reason to suggest they might not have some interest in doing so again. Maybe Larry doesn't want to come back after how that situation went here, but still, like, we have to keep him in mind. But I'd also throw out Matt Ioannidis. I mean, he's a guy who had some really strong production early in his career, and then, I think he dealt with some injuries there in Washington, and then ended up in Carolina this past year and only had a sack. I mean, the production has dropped off certainly a little bit, but if we're talking about value here, not a guy that I'm counting on to come in and be the 8.5, 7.5 sack guy that he was a couple of times earlier in his career, but rotate in on that defensive line. I still think there's some upside there. I still think he's a really good player and still would like to have him as a part of my defensive line if he comes in at a pretty good value. Or at nose tackle, A'Shawn Robinson, the former Alabama first round pick, or did he end up falling to the second round? Regardless, he's a big, strong nose tackle. Yeah, second round there to the Detroit Lions. Was there for a handful of years and then spent the last few years with the Rams. Like, I think he's a good, solid nose tackle on that interior. I believe he tore his meniscus about middle of last season, so there's an injury thing there that might lead to him being a late free agent signing, but he's supposed to be projected to be kind of ready to go for the main offseason activities. But I'd love to take a flyer on a player like that. Or a guy like Poona Ford, the former Seattle Seahawk. I mean, he's shown a lot of upside there. As again, like, we're talking nose tackles at this point, so you're not getting a 5 or 10 sack guy there, but big, strong, physical interior player who's still an ascending guy at age 27 there. He was just been, like a little on the shorter side, but just big and stout in the middle of that defensive line. And I feel like he would be a strong, like, solid but not sexy nose tackle type signing for the Bears. Or on the edge, I look at guys like Carl Nassib from the Raiders, who's had plenty of upside, or Shaq Lawson from the Bills, DeMarcus Walker from the Tennessee Titans. None of those guys are going to be like show up and be 10 sack guys. But if you can get them at a good price to rotate in at your edge rusher position, like, I feel like you'd feel pretty good about that. These are guys that can be potential high upside guys to get you more sacks than you're probably paying for on their contract. And that's anytime you can have cheap, affordable pass rush, that's very valuable. And you'd love to see as much of that as possible. At offensive tackle, I wonder how expensive Donovan Smith is going to be after being released by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I imagine he's not going to be cheap, but he's kind of coming off of maybe his worst season. He's coming off of a down year for him and some injuries in there as well that are going to complicate some of this for him. But he's been if not great, a solid left tackle for a decent amount of time in the NFL. Former second-round pick out of Penn State. Like, he's going to be 30 years old, but a solid offensive tackle guy who could be worth more valuable dollar for dollar than some of the more expensive tackles like Juwan Taylor or Caleb McGarry in terms of the full bang for your buck that you're going to get out of that position. I'd throw Jermaine Elamuna in there from formerly the Baltimore Ravens. He's been a swing tackle for a while in his career, but every time he spot starts, he seems to do a good job. So if you want like value at right tackle to compete with Larry Borum and Alex Leatherwood, I'd love a guy like Elamuna, although I would rather go with a more sure thing at offensive tackle as opposed to like playing around with competitions and value there. Like, that's the one spot I'm kind of tired of doing value with. Let's go get more sure things on the offensive line because it's that important. Or at wide receiver, to me, it's kind of like, well, which guy's going to be willing to give you that value? Like DJ Chark from the Detroit Lions didn't really do much this year, but we've seen him be a 1,000-yard guy before in Jacksonville. Let me repeat that. In Jacksonville, he's been a 1,000-yard guy. I know it didn't translate as well for Allen Robinson, but he was pretty good on some not great Jaguars offenses, and we feel like he has some of that upside and talent that could come at a pretty low deal. Or Darius Slayton from the New York Giants. Similar kind of story. Like, we've seen him play really, really well, but has also been stuck on some kind of bad New York Giants offenses. But can you get back to that guy who was a 750-yard receiver a couple times and still broke 700 yards this season? I mean, he was good, but just not like the same level of that felt like, great, got to have him pay as much money as you can. Like, go get him as a value type guy. Like, let's see what that price tag might look like and if he could be an affordable option to rotate in there with Darnell Mooney and Chase Claypool. Not as a number one, right? Not as the solution at wide receiver, but more quality, talent, and depth to rotate in there. Throw in maybe Jarvis Landry, a little on the older side, probably more closer to the Odell Beckham camp of wanting to go to a true Super Bowl contender, but a slot guy who can do some damage underneath, absolutely. Or Paris Campbell from the Indianapolis Colts. Another one with the injury concern that I think is going to keep his price tag low, but the Matt Eberflus would certainly know him better than some of the other coaches out there. And this was kind of his first season playing really, the best year of his career certainly is over 60 catches and 600 yards, but it's only been 1 year of that production. So you wonder, our team's going to be lining up to give him a long-term deal given his inability to really stay consistently healthy before that? Or will it be a 1 year kind of prove it again type deal? And that's the kind of value that the Bears could find with somebody like Paris Campbell. So I feel like there's some good value to be had there. There's some strong second tier guys to fill in a lot of the cracks. And maybe the Bears will end up with one or maybe two of the big name free agents that they really put a high priority on. I would love to hear what free agents you want the Chicago Bears to sign. Let us know in the comments on the YouTube video for this Locked On Bears podcast. Tweet us at Locked On Bears. Join the conversation in the Locked On Bears Facebook group as well. And make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening or watching the podcast on YouTube. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. If you want even more Bears talk, I'm going to be doing a Chicago Bears live stream today as this podcast comes out. It's going to be at 2 o'clock Central Time with Bleacher Report on the BR app, or Bleacher Report's app. We're doing a live stream talking all things Chicago Bears offseason. So go check that out. And if you're listening to this and we're already past 2 o'clock Central Time on Thursday, we're going to be doing another live stream at noon on Monday. So free agency opens at 11 a.m. Central Time on Monday, or negotiations start 11 a.m. Central Time Monday. At noon, an hour after negotiations start, we'll be live again on the Bleacher Report app, talking all things Bears signings and breaking down whatever moves they make up to that point. So I hope you'll come check that out. I hope you'll come back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears. Appreciate you making us your first listen each and every day. And in return, I always make sure I give you an opportunity to bear down.